I want to start us off by talking about the importance of technological progress. And to do that, I want to show some evidence. You know how songwriters say once in a while, I wish I'd written that song? The geek equivalent, I think, is, I wish I had drawn that graph. I want to show you a graph that I wish I had drawn. And it's data that comes from here in the UK. And it goes back just about 1,000 years. And it's a graph about how well the British worker was doing. So let me explain here. What we've got is how many workers, how many people there were in Britain on the horizontal axis, and then how well they were doing, what their real wage was like on the vertical axis. And what you notice there is that for hundreds of years, we were doing really poorly. In fact, the only way people got wealthier is if there were fewer people. There was a fixed amount of stuff to go around, and the only way we got richer is if there were fewer of us around. And the instant population increased, we all became poorer as a result. We were honestly, this country was trapped in a Malthusian hell for hundreds of years. In the 1600s, for reasons that nobody understands, things got a little bit better, and then it looked like we were being trapped in a somewhat more pleasant Malthusian hell. And then something happened that completely changed the course, completely changed the trajectory of life in this country. And for the first time ever, we had a happy situation, a virtuous cycle, where people got, on average, better and better off as there were more and more and more of them over time. We'd never, ever seen this before. I want to broaden this story out a little bit. It turns out this is not particular to the UK, and it's not particular just to the last 1,000 years. I want to put up a graph that I did draw, show you 4,000 years worth of history and what some of the big stories in human history have been over that time. My new favorite dinner party question is, what do you think the big stories of human history have been? And when you ask that, here are some of the results that you see. People will talk about wars. They'll talk about empires. They'll talk about the founding of some of the world's great religions. Some people will bring up the Renaissance, or the cheery souls will bring up the plagues and the Black Death and things like that. But in gray there are some of my most frequent answers to the most important story in human history. What you can see clearly from this graph is that they are wrong. There's all this stuff going on. Meanwhile, if you look at the black line, which is how many people there are on the planet, or the blue line, which is a really lovely calculation about how advanced our civilizations were, both in the East and the West, you notice that none of these big stories bent the curve of human history very much at all. We were just kind of ticking along. And then honestly, at one point in time, that curve of human history went from boring horizontal to unbelievably exciting vertical, basically in the blink of an eye. And the story of what did that, honestly, it's a technology story. It's not solely a technology story, but this shift would not have happened without the tinkering of James Watt that led to the steam engine, that led to the Industrial Revolution, that led to the internal combustion engine and electricity, and put humanity on this technologically accelerated trajectory that it had never, ever seen before. Now, this is a really happy story. It's a fundamentally happy story. There were some challenges that came up along the way. These big shifts are never accomplished without some challenges. In this country, we had terrible smog, killer smog for a while. We had terrible exploitation of child labor. We don't have those things anymore here. We made choices as a people to deal with the problems. There is no more child labor in Britain, and the skies here are cleaner than they've been since at least the 1500s. So challenges come up. What astonishes me is how good a job we do of dealing with them. Now, I drew these pictures to tell you a story about what's going on right now, because I honestly believe, and the reason we titled our book The Second Machine Age, is that all of us have the really good fortune to be here at a time when we're seeing the next huge leap forward with technology, the next amazing acceleration in technological progress, and it's coming as a result of all these things we're doing with our new digital tools, with software and hardware and networks and robots and artificial intelligence and mobile, all this grab bag of stuff that we have. Honestly, I believe is really changing the trajectory of human history again. To try to make that point, I want to take you on a whirlwind tour just of the past 5 years of some of the weird breakthroughs, some of the crazy I believe they're science fiction breakthroughs that we've seen just in the past 5 years. In 2010, our hosts announced that they had been driving fully autonomous cars on American roads in traffic with no mishaps. My favorite part, they announced it in a blog post. Just, here, we're driving cars completely autonomously. My co-author and I had the chance to ride in one of these cars a while back. And what I can tell you is that the experience of being a passenger in a fully autonomous vehicle goes from being terrifying to thrilling to boring in the space of about 15 minutes. Because it turns out the car drives the way that we're all taught to in our driver's education classes, and then we forget about immediately for the rest of our lives. It doesn't speed, it doesn't weave, it doesn't have a middle finger. All it does is go down the road obeying all relevant statutes. It's an amazing technology, and really it becomes a boring experience very quickly. In 2011, a team at IBM built a supercomputer called Watson that took on the two best American champions at one of our national institutions, which is this weird televised quiz show that we call Jeopardy. It's been on TV for decades. It's incredibly popular. Watson went up against two of the best human champions ever, and it was not even close. Watson took home more than 3 times as much money as either of the two humans. They were good sports about the competition, though. The guy on the left, his name is Ken Jennings. He won before Watson came along. He won 73 times in a row. Most of us think he was genetically engineered and raised from birth by ninjas only to play the game of Jeopardy. He got stomped by this piece of technology. He had a good sense of humor about it. When he put up his final answer and he realized what had just happened, he said parenthetically, a great motto for the second machine age, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords." In other words, in my little domain, the torch has been passed from human superiority over to digital superiority. In 2012, our hosts realized that there are cats on the internet. That's the silly way to talk about this advance. What the team actually did was build a cutting-edge artificial intelligence system on top of $1 million of very specialized hardware. And they fed it a bunch of internet video. And they didn't try to train it at all or tell it what to look for. They just said, you tell us. What are the themes? What are the motifs? What kinds of things keep recurring in this body of information? System thought and came back and said there seem to be these things called faces out there. There are a lot of them. The faces sit on these things called bodies, and they look like this. And then there are all these small, fluffy things that the faces seem really enamored of. We're going to call those cats. The AI specialist would call this unsupervised learning. I would call it something more like induction or inference or a style of learning that's really inherent to all of us, that technologies have historically been really, really bad at, and now they're getting quite good at it. In 2013, one of the researchers on this project, Andrew Ng, realized that not everybody has $1 million of cutting-edge AI hardware to play with. And he set about trying to democratize this kind of innovation. Could he do the same thing on a much cheaper hardware platform? He used the graphics processing units that are in all the gaming consoles that we have, and he was able, 1 year later, to replicate the results, not with $1 million of hardware, with $20,000 worth of hardware. 50-fold improvement for a year. This makes Moore's law itself look really unimpressive. This is the kind of improvement we're seeing in some of these fundamental disciplines. Last year, Microsoft announced that not only with Skype could you make free calls around the world to just about anybody. Starting in 2014, you could make free calls around the world to people with whom you did not share a language, because Skype started to enable nearly real-time translation between languages. Again, this is very science fiction stuff. At least one venture capital company in 2014 gave an algorithm an actual vote about which investments to pursue, because they felt it could do a better job of scanning the entire environment and being objective about an investment opportunity. This year is still young. So far, though, we've seen some pretty amazing things. A team here in the UK built another artificial intelligence system, and they pointed it at a task. The task was playing 80s era Atari video games. I think some people in this room have probably wasted a lot of time on those games. They pointed the system at these games and they said, learn how to play them well. What they didn't do was try to say what the rules of the game were, what it was about, what a good strategy was for playing this game well. All they did was say, you see that number in the upper right-hand corner? It's called the score. Your job is to maximize it. You figure it out. That system is now the world's best player of Space Invaders, Pong, Breakout, and Battlezone, which was my personal favorite as a teenager. I didn't need to waste all those hours. The system was going to come along and do a better job of defending the planet than I ever could. People have been talking recently about some of the dangers of artificial intelligence. Elon Musk talks about summoning the demon. I'm not very worried about that. I am a little worried, though, that we're summoning the Terminator. Remember in Terminator 2 how the robot would rise up out of that pool of mercury and form itself? I saw something very much like this earlier this year at the TED conference. While the inventor of this technology was speaking, a 3D part formed itself out of that pile of goo and just emerged out of that broth on stage while the guy was talking. So the advances that we're seeing with digital technologies, they're not even combined to the digital world anymore. They're showing up in manufacturing. They're showing up in transportation. This is a revolution that's going to go all around the planet, and it's going to happen quite quickly. As I mentioned a little while back, there's so much good news here, and I think this is the best economic news on the planet. I would broaden out. I think this is the best news on the planet, full stop. But, as always, there are challenges that are coming along with it. And as I look at the situation, the challenges that we're seeing are economic, and they have to do with, as technology is racing ahead so quickly, it feels like it's leaving some people behind. Let me show you a little bit of evidence about what's going on. I'm going to switch over from the UK to the US, and I want to do something ridiculously ambitious. I'm going to draw a graph of the health of the post-war US economy with 4 lines on it. This is a terrible oversimplification, but bear with me. 4 lines to summarize the health of the US economy. What you need to know is up is better on this graph. And the other thing you need to know is for decades after the end of the war, we were doing better. All 4 of these things were getting better. They were getting better almost in lockstep. And this was what gave us the large, stable, prosperous middle class that we really enjoy these days. The 4 lines are the things that, you know how economists agree on absolutely nothing? Here you would get surprising agreement. If you asked a group of economists to give you these 4 lines, they would say, you've got to do output. So here's GDP per capita. They'd say you have to do productivity. We're getting better at turning our inputs into outputs. Are we generating jobs? And are those jobs, on average, good jobs? Let's look at the average pay, the pay for that person in the 50th percentile. Look how good a job we were doing for decades after the end of the war on those 4 things. And what we've noticed more recently is a divergence, a decoupling in these things that we care so much about. 2 of them, the gray and the blue, have continued on a pretty healthy upward trajectory. We'd like more, but they're not on a terrible trajectory. Those are the 2 that have to do with output, either our GDP per capita or our productivity. Unfortunately, look at those other 2. Look at the green, which is that 50th percentile income. It's tapered off. It's actually heading slowly in the wrong direction over time. This is a challenge. Our job growth has stalled out as well. And I want to show you one other graph, again, covering the entire post-war history. Before I do that, though, I need to make one thing really, really clear to this group. I am not a communist. And I need to say that because I'm about to show a graph of capital versus labor. And when I do that, everyone expects me to have a Che t-shirt on and start chanting Marxist slogans. I'm not going to do that. But we can't ignore the fact that capital and labor are moving in some pretty different directions these days. So here's capital versus labor for the post-war period. The blue line there are the returns to capital, US corporate profits as a percent of the GDP. You notice that they're in a really healthy place these days after that little divot for the Great Recession. The red line is the total amount of GDP paid out in wages. And you notice that after doing a dance back and forth for decades with that red line, with the blue line. The red line has really started to drop off in a fairly sharp way just since the turn of the century. This is not just a US phenomenon. We're noticing this over and over. So I show these graphs to highlight that there are challenges coming up in the second machine age. The question is, what do we do about them? And you're hearing a lot of different ideas about what to do about them. I want to leave you with a principle for how to approach these challenges. It comes from a colleague of mine who studied the internet and studied the digital economy so well, and he makes a great observation. Larry Lessig says, look, with our policies, with the things we do, we have a choice. We can protect the past from the future, or we can protect the future from the past. If we believe the future is a better place, and I believe that to the core, if we believe the future is a better place, then our task is pretty simple. Let's protect the forces of the past, the people who like things the way they were, from the people who are trying to take us into the future. Our job is to protect the future. Thanks all very much.